Okay. You know, the conversation this morning we were talking about is we have to believe God is in control, and that it's really hard to do when we look out. But we're going to work on this today, and I'll just hopefully give you all a few things to think about it. Like, nothing is new, so we'll try to encourage each other. Yeah. Okay. This is a poem by Carrie ten Boom. My life is but a weaving between my God and me. I cannot choose the colors he weaveth steadily. Oft times he weaveth sorrow, and I in foolish pride forget he sees the upper and I the underside. Not till the loom is silent and the shuttles cease to fly will God unroll the canvas and reveal the reason why. The dark threads are as needful in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern he had planned. He knows, he loves, he cares. Nothing this truth can dim. He gives the very best to those who leave the choice to him. God's providence, what does it mean? Is God able to control everything in the universe? Can we trust him and submit to his plans? These questions are as old as the ones that Job asked, and a topic as difficult to grasp as it is to catch the wind. When Gilda told us the topic for this quarter would be God's providence, I honestly didn't know the definition of providence. We had studied the names of God several years ago and studied Jehovah Jireh, God who provides. I think you did that one. And I can understand that. I can humbly acknowledge that God provides for us every day, from the air we breathe, the food we eat, the people in our lives, the circumstances of our existence. But providence is much more than provision. One definition says God's providence is the unceasing activity of the Creator, whereby in overflowing bounty and goodwill, he upholds his creatures in ordered existence, guides and governs all events, circumstances, and free acts of angels and men, and directs everything to its appointed goal for his own glory. The book we are using for an outline for this quarter is called Trusting God, and he talks about in here a lot about how hard it is to trust God as opposed to just obey God. But in this book by Jerry Bridges, he condenses that definition to one easier to remember. God's providence is his constant care for and his absolute rule over all his creation for his glory and the good of his people. The providence of God is factual because of the sovereignty of God. The definition of sovereign means possessing supreme dominion, supreme in power, ruler, superior to all others. God's sovereignty means that he has the right and the power to do whatever he chooses. His sovereignty is his absolute independence to do as he pleases and his absolute control over the actions of all his creatures. No creature, person, or empire can thwart his will or act outside the boundaries of his will. After reading several books, chapters in several books, I should say, and sermons from men who are 1,000 times more knowledgeable than I am, I did find a preface from almost every one of those authors who admitted to not completely understanding or comprehending the providence of God. So what I'm bringing today is my take on the scriptures and on the explanations of these biblical scholars. Hopefully it will give you something to consider. Yes, God's riches are very great, and his wisdom and knowledge have no end. No one can explain the thing God decides or understand his ways. And another author I read, Wayne Jackson, wrote in the Christian Chronicle, the word providence is not found in the Bible. The English term providence derives from the Latin providentia, which signifies foresight. Providence has to do with the Creator's maintenance of the functional balance of the natural world, the fulfillment of the divine purpose in the regulation of international affairs, and God's special operation in the lives of those who seek to do his will. Providence is the activity of God as accomplished through law, as in laws of nature. It stands in contrast to the miraculous by which the Lord operates independent of law. One biblical example of this is Mary's miraculous conception of Jesus, as opposed to the Lord's answer to Hannah's prayer for a son. One was miraculous, one was providence by his design. God's providence for us began with creation. Who can question the absolute genius of the workings of the earth and its inhabitants? The Godhead's creation and sustaining of our universe is not something that can really be understood by us. All things are indebted for their existence to the continuous sustaining action of God exercised through his Son. Nothing exists of its own inherent power of being. Nothing in all creation stands or acts independently of the Lord's will. The so-called laws of nature are nothing more than the physical expression of the steady will of Christ. The law of gravity operates with unceasing certainty because Christ continuously wills it to operate. He brings out the starry host one by one and calls them each by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. He supplies the earth with rain and makes grass grow on the hills, and he provides food for the cattle and the young ravens when they call. Everything in his design is meant to continue until he desires to make a change. The Bible teaches that God also governs the actions of all life, including animals and people. Daniel 4:35 says, he does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? Jeremiah asked in Lamentations, who can speak and have it happen if the Lord has not decreed it? No one can act outside of God's sovereign will or against it. Centuries ago, Augustine said, nothing therefore happens unless the omnipotent wills it to happen. He either permits it to happen or he brings it about himself. Nothing is too large or small to escape God's governing hand, even though it may not be obvious to us in our lifetime. The Lord says, my thoughts are not like your thoughts. Your ways are not like my ways. Just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. In order to understand the scope of providence, we need to consider these points. God never operates providentially in any way that is in conflict with his nature or his revealed will. God is holy and righteous and would not tempt people to do evil. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Divine providence does not negate man's freedom of will. God will not coerce a person to do either evil or good, but he can use people to accomplish his divine purpose. Even though nothing happens outside of God's will, there is also no part of God's plan that can be stopped. Although the Lord has given man free will, and man is able to reject God and his teachings, nothing man can do is outside of God's will. In his heart, a man plans his course, but the Lord determines his steps. Many are the plans in a man's heart, but it's the Lord's purpose that prevails. There is no wisdom, no insight, no plan that can succeed against the Lord. These are the words of him who is holy and true, who holds the key of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. The providential must be distinguished from the miraculous. A miracle is God working on a plane that is above that of natural law. Providence is his utilization of natural law. In a miracle, the Lord works directly, and in providence, he operates indirectly, employing means to accomplish the end. When God provided manna dropped from heaven for the Israelites, he provided a miracle for them each day. But now we are fed by his gracious and natural provisions. Yet he proved he is real by showing kindness, by giving you rain from heaven and crops at the right times, by giving you food and filling your hearts with joy. In providence, God works behind the scenes. We know that providence is provable because the Bible teaches it. But it is also non-provable because no person can point to particular circumstances and say, I know that was a providence of God. Consider the account of Esther. Although Haman planned evil against Mordecai, God used providence to save his people. Can you see God's hand in a way that the king could not sleep that particular night? That the reader that Xerxes summoned read from a specific area of the book where Mordecai's actions were recorded? That Mordecai had not been previously rewarded so that the king would ask about him. That Haman came at that moment to ask about hanging Mordecai. God was sovereignly operating the events of that night to save his people. As Mordecai asked, and who knows, you may have been chosen queen for just such a time as this. From the farthest point of the universe to the hairs on our head, to the sparrows in the tree, we believe that God's interest and concern for us is genuine. He only wants the best for us. 2 sparrows cost only a penny, but not even one of them can die without your Father's knowing it. God even knows how many hairs are on your head. So don't be afraid. You are worth much more than many sparrows. But back to Bridges' definition. God's providence is his constant care for and his absolute rule over all his creation for his own glory and the good of his people. 4 points in this definition: constant care, absolute rule, all creation, and his own glory and the good of his people. His constant care is evident in the continuity of the human race and the earth itself. Consider the cycles of the seasons, and consider the gravity that defines our planet. Consider the formation of life after its own kind. The very air we breathe and the elements that provide our bodies with the nutrients we need are examples of his constant care. Even more than that, we have God's assurance that he takes care of us, as God told the Israelites. Even when you are old, I will be the same. Even when your hair is turned gray, I will take care of you. I made you and will take care of you. I will carry you and save you. Can you compare me to anyone? No one is equal to me or like me. God's absolute rule and power are documented throughout the Bible. Nothing is so small or trivial to escape the attention of God's sovereign control. Nothing is so great to be beyond his power to control it. Even the Roman Empire's ability to crucify Jesus Christ was controlled by God. When Pilate said, "Don't you know I have the power to set you free and power to have you crucified?" Jesus answered, "The only power you have over me is the power given to you by God." Other examples of God's sovereign will include the jealousy and evil intent of Joseph's brothers, who were instrumental in God's plan to once again save his people. But at the time of the events, even Joseph would not have been able to absolutely say why any of this was part of God's plan. Paul's incarceration and ability to spread the gospel might have been accepted by him, but Paul would not ascertain how this would be accomplished at the time. We are able to see from history how God worked in those instances. And when we look back at events in our lives, we see the hand of God. For his own glory and the good of his people, God's act of providence is seeing to foresight everything. God makes sure that everything that needs to be done to see his purposes fulfilled will be done. I declare the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, "My counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose." Romans 8:28 is a scripture of comfort for us, as much as is John 3:16. Most Christians are reassured, especially when going through adversity, to proclaim Paul's declaration that we know that everything God works for the good of those who love him. They are the people he called because that was his plan. In one of Wayne Jackson's essays titled, "All Things Work Together for Good, Controversy, or Comfort," he explained some of his thinkings towards this verse. The expression, "we know," exudes an air of confidence. In a context where suffering is a major portion of the discussion, it is important that the Apostle Paul establishes the truth that hardships in the life of the Christian do not imply that God is unconcerned with his plight. In spite of life's hardships, we must be able to say, we know that he is a providential companion in our lives. Paul uses the word everything in this chapter numerous times to indicate a general referral to the world. Everything God made was waiting. Everything God made was changed because God wanted it. As we look at the world around us today and see the chaos and evil, and we get discouraged by the condition of our country, our only consolation is to believe that God is in control. Works for the good is an active voice, present tense, which indicates that the activity orchestrated by God is ongoing. The Lord is as providentially active on behalf of his people today as he was in biblical times. God is working out things for his people that will result in our ultimate good, which means heaven. We have to be confident that the sufferings and hardships we go through are meant to lead us closer to him. As Joseph said to his brothers, "And as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save the lives of many people." The heartaches and disappointments that come to us have these benefits. This one. God is working good in helping us build character. My brothers and sisters, when you have many kinds of troubles, you should be full of joy because you know that these troubles test your faith and this will give you patience. Let your patience show itself perfectly in what you do. Then you will be perfect and complete and will have everything you need. God does good by opening doors of service. Paul said, "But I will stay at Ephesus until Pentecost, because a good opportunity for a great and growing work has been given to me now. and there are many people working against me. God does good by allowing us to glorify him. As Job declared, the Lord has given and the Lord has taken. May the name of the Lord be blessed. You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being. Bridges asked the question, can you trust God? But the question itself has two possible meanings. Can you trust God? Is he dependable in times of adversity? The other meaning is, can you trust God? Do you have such a relationship with God and such a confidence in him that you believe he is with you in your adversity, even though you do not see any evidence of his presence and his power? The Lord defends those who suffer. He defends them in times of trouble. Those who know the Lord trust him because he will not leave those who came to him. When Jesus was preparing the apostles for the greatest trial of all, for him as he faced the cross, and for them as they tried to understand his prophecies, he asked them to trust him and the fact that he would return for them. Jesus said, don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust in me. But Bridges acknowledged that it is often more difficult to trust God than it is to obey him. The moral will of God given to us in the Bible is rational and reasonable. But the circumstances in which we must trust God often appear irrational and inexplicable. The law of God is readily recognized to be good for us, even when we don't want to obey it. But the circumstances of our lives frequently appear to be dreadful and grim, or perhaps even calamitous and tragic. Whoops. Stop that. Something happened. Well, boo. I knew it was going too good, too easy. Obeying God is worked out within well-defined boundaries of God's revealed will. Trusting God is worked out in an arena that has no boundaries. We do not know the extent, the duration, or the frequency of the painful, adverse circumstances in which we must frequently trust God. But when we fail to trust God, we doubt his sovereignty and question his goodness. If we are to trust God in everything, we must believe these essential truths. God is completely sovereign. God is infinite in wisdom, and God is perfect in love. God in his love always wills what is best for us. In his wisdom, he always knows what is best. And in his sovereignty, he has the power to bring it about. Confidence in the sovereignty of God in all that affects us is crucial to our trusting him. If there is a single event in all of the universe that can occur outside of God's sovereign control, then we cannot trust him. But as Paul said, that is why I am suffering as I am. Yet I am not ashamed, because I know whom I have believed and am convinced that he is able to guard what I have entrusted for him for that day. Some of the lessons in this quarter include God's sovereignty over people, nature, and nations, We'll discuss the wisdom of God and our responsibility to acknowledge his sovereignty. The Bible and history convict us of his ability to sustain us through hardships and adversity. There are also circumstances that may never be understood in our lifetime, but we need to be convinced that everything is part of God's ultimate plan and his wisdom is unquestionable. But we can choose to trust him and give him thanks for every good thing he has planned for us. To trust his plan, his ability to sustain his plan, and his willingness to see it through to eternity. And I want to close with the words from a song we often sing. I know not what of good or ill may be reserved for me, of weary ways or golden days before his face I see. But I know whom I have believed and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I committed unto him against that day. We just have to believe God's in control.